4 words from a 7-year-old boy stopped the Tonight Show cold. But it wasn't the words themselves that shattered Jimmy Fallon's composure. It was the silence that followed. To truly comprehend the profound weight of this unprecedented television moment, we must journey back to the very beginning of a day that started like any other at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, a building historically known for laughter, lighthearted celebrity banter, and the predictable rhythm of late-night comedy, but which on this particular evening would be transformed into a sanctuary of shared human suffering, extraordinary compassion, and sacred vulnerability. Let me take you back to the hours just before the cameras began to roll, deep in the labyrinthine corridors backstage, where the air hummed with the usual electric anxiety of producers, writers, and stagehands rushing to finalize the evening's script. Jonathan Roumie, the beloved actor known globally for his deeply moving portrayal of Jesus in The Chosen, was sitting quietly in his dressing room, mentally preparing for what was supposed to be a standard promotional interview, unaware that his day was about to intersect with a tragedy so heartbreaking it would leave a permanent mark on his soul. Just outside his door, a small, frail figure stood nervously in the hallway, clutching a worn, leather-bound notebook against his chest, like a shield against the overwhelming machinery of the television studio. This was Tommy, a 7-year-old boy who carried a burden no child should ever have to bear, his small frame bearing the visible toll of his own battle with illness, but his eyes reflecting a desperate, unwavering determination to fulfill a mission entrusted to him by his hero. Tommy's father, a man who had fought stage 4 cancer with an inspiring, quiet dignity for 3 grueling years, had recently passed away, leaving behind a legacy of faith, a devastated but resilient family, and that leather-bound notebook now pressed against his son's beating heart. The hallway encounter between Tommy and Jonathan was not scheduled on any producer's rundown, nor was it anticipated by the security personnel who normally shield celebrities from unexpected visitors. But when Jonathan stepped out of his dressing room and saw the boy standing there, trembling slightly under the harsh fluorescent lights, an unspoken, profound connection was instantly forged. Jonathan dropped to one knee, bringing himself to eye level with the child, his natural compassion radiating as he asked the boy his name and gently inquired about the notebook clutched in his small, shaking hands. Tommy, his voice barely above a whisper, explained that his father had been a massive fan of The Chosen, finding deep spiritual solace and hope in Jonathan's performance during the darkest, most agonizing days of his chemotherapy treatments, and that before he died, he had made Tommy promise to deliver a specific message to the man who had brought him so much comfort. Jonathan's eyes immediately filled with tears as he listened to the child speak of his father's suffering and unyielding love, the actor's heart breaking at the sight of this brave little boy navigating the crushing weight of grief while simultaneously fighting his own terrifying health battles. The actor gently placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder, offering a silent prayer of comfort, and in that fleeting, sacred hallway moment, the boundaries between celebrity and fan completely dissolved, replaced by a shared, raw humanity that transcended the superficial gloss of the entertainment industry. Fast forward 15 minutes later, the pulsing, upbeat theme music of The Tonight Show echoed through the studio as Jimmy Fallon bounded onto the stage, delivering his monologue with his trademark infectious energy, completely unaware of the emotional tidal wave gathering just off stage. The audience laughed reliably at the topical jokes, the band played their lively transitions, and the meticulously planned machinery of late-night television operated with its usual flawless precision, creating a stark, jarring contrast to the profound, quiet tragedy waiting in the wings. When it was time for Jonathan's segment, he walked out to enthusiastic applause, taking his seat next to Jimmy's iconic wooden desk. But the actor's demeanor was visibly altered, his usual charismatic smile replaced by a solemn, reflective expression that immediately signaled to the host and the audience that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Jimmy, sensing the shift in the room's energy, leaned forward, his comedic persona momentarily suspended as Jonathan took a deep breath and began to recount the heartbreaking encounter he had just experienced in the hallway, painting a vivid, agonizing picture of the brave 7-year-old boy and the dying father who had found solace in a television show. The studio audience, previously primed for lighthearted celebrity anecdotes, fell into a stunned, reverent silence, the collective breath of hundreds of people hitching in their throats as Jonathan described the worn leather notebook and the incredible burden placed upon Tommy's small shoulders. With Jimmy's gentle encouragement, Jonathan signaled to the producers, and the stage doors opened once more to reveal young Tommy, who walked out under the glaring studio lights, the massive, intimidating space of Stage 6B feeling suddenly intimate and sacred as he approached the desk. Jimmy Fallon, a man known for his quick wit and constant motion, was instantly immobilized by the sight of the frail child, his eyes welling with tears as he reached out to shake Tommy's hand, offering him a seat of honor between the two beloved celebrities. Jonathan then asked Tommy if he would be willing to share the letter his father had written, and with a brave nod, the boy handed over a piece of paper that had been carefully folded and tucked inside the front cover of the notebook. As Jonathan unfolded the letter, his hands visibly shook, the paper rustling softly against the microphone, a delicate sound that echoed loudly in the absolutely silent studio. He began to read the father's words, his rich, resonant voice cracking under the emotional weight of a dying man's final testament, a letter that spoke not of fear or anger at his terminal diagnosis, but of immense, overflowing gratitude, profound faith, and an agonizing, beautiful love for the son he was leaving behind. The father wrote of the countless nights he and Tommy had spent watching The Chosen together in the hospital room, the soft glow of the screen providing a temporary refuge from the terrifying reality of stage 4 cancer, and how the show had sparked deep, meaningful conversations about hope, redemption, and the promise of a life beyond suffering. He wrote directly to Jonathan, thanking him for lending his face and voice to a message of divine comfort that had carried him through his darkest valleys. And then, in a devastating postscript, the father addressed Jimmy Fallon, thanking the comedian for providing the laughter that had served as a vital medicine on the days when the pain was simply too much to bear. As Jonathan read these words, Jimmy Fallon completely broke character, his face crumpling as he buried his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs, the realization that his silly late-night jokes had brought genuine comfort to a dying man piercing through his comedic armor and touching the deepest, most vulnerable parts of his soul. The audience was openly weeping, the sound of sniffles and stifled crying filling the room, creating an atmosphere of shared, overwhelming grief that is entirely unprecedented in the history of late-night television. Jonathan, his own face wet with tears, struggled to finish the final lines of the letter, his voice dropping to a harsh, emotional whisper as he read the father's final plea, asking Jonathan to remind Tommy that his dad would always be watching over him, cheering him on in his own fight against illness. When the reading concluded, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the studio, a silence so thick and profound it felt as though time itself had stopped entirely. Jonathan folded the letter and handed it back to Tommy, looking at the boy with a mixture of awe and heartbreaking sorrow, while Jimmy, still struggling to regain his composure, grabbed a tissue and wiped his streaming eyes, entirely incapable of speaking. It was then, in that fragile, shattered silence, that Tommy looked up at Jonathan and Jimmy, his small, pale face illuminated by a strength that defied his years, and delivered the climax of this incredible encounter. The boy softly yet clearly spoke 4 words into his microphone, saying, "He kept his promise." Those 4 words hung in the air, a devastatingly simple declaration that confused Jimmy for a fraction of a second before the true, staggering meaning washed over him and Jonathan simultaneously. Tommy explained that his dad had promised he would fight the cancer long enough to see Tommy's 7th birthday, a milestone the doctors had said was statistically impossible, but the father had indeed survived just 3 days past the birthday, holding on through unimaginable agony simply to keep his word to his little boy. Upon hearing this, Jimmy Fallon lost whatever tiny fraction of composure he had managed to scrape together, letting out a raw, audible gasp before burying his face in his arms on the desk, openly sobbing on national television in a display of pure, unfiltered vulnerability that shattered every convention of his profession. Jonathan Roumie leaned over and pulled Tommy into a fierce, protective embrace, his own tears soaking into the boy's shirt as the actor wept not just for the loss of a father, but for the incredible, agonizing beauty of a love so strong it could defy medical science and hold back death itself just long enough to keep a promise. The cameras continued to roll, capturing this astonishing, unscripted tableau of three human beings, a global comedy icon, a revered dramatic actor, and a sick little boy, all bound together in a crucible of shared human suffering and profound empathy. The silence that followed Tommy's four words was not empty. It was filled with the heavy, sacred weight of 1,000 unspoken emotions, a silence that demanded reverence and completely commanded the attention of every single soul in the room and the millions who would eventually watch the broadcast. No one dared to interrupt the moment, no producer signaled for a commercial break, and no band played a transition chord. The world simply stopped to bear witness to the raw power of a child's love and a father's enduring legacy. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, Jimmy lifted his head, his eyes red and swollen, and managed to whisper a choked, heartfelt thank you to Tommy, acknowledging that this was the most meaningful moment he had ever experienced in his entire career. The segment ended not with applause or a comedic sign-off, but with a slow, gentle fade to black, leaving the audience to sit with the profound emotional resonance of what they had just witnessed. But the story did not end when the cameras stopped rolling. In fact, the most extraordinary revelation occurred roughly 6 months later, when Jonathan Roumie revealed the contents of the rest of that leather-bound notebook during a separate, incredibly emotional interview. Let me take you back to the dressing room after the Tonight Show taping, where Jonathan, Jimmy, and Tommy sat together, exhausted but deeply connected by the shared emotional catharsis. Tommy had opened the notebook to show the men what else his father had left behind, and what they discovered inside forced them to confront an even deeper layer of the father's extraordinary foresight and limitless love. The notebook was not just a diary. It was a meticulously mapped-out collection of dated letters, carefully written and sealed by the dying father, intended to be opened by Tommy on specific future milestones of his life. There were letters labeled for Tommy's first day of high school, his graduation, his wedding day, and even a letter meant for the day Tommy became a father himself, each envelope a physical manifestation of a love that refused to be silenced by death. The father, knowing his time was tragically short, had spent his final pain-filled months pouring his wisdom, his blessings, and his enduring presence into those pages, ensuring that even though he could not be there in body, his spirit would forever guide and comfort his son through all of life's critical moments. Jonathan described holding the notebook, feeling the profound, almost physical weight of the father's sacrifice, and realizing that the letter read on The Tonight Show was merely the prologue to a lifetime of posthumous guidance and unwavering devotion. Jimmy Fallon, upon seeing the dated letters, had reportedly broken down once again backstage, overwhelmed by the staggering realization of how fiercely a parent can love a child, a sentiment that resonated deeply with his own experiences as a father. The revelation of the notebook added an entirely new, breathtaking dimension to the story, transforming it from a tragic tale of loss into a triumphant, enduring testament to the indestructible nature of familial love and the beautiful, heartbreaking ways we attempt to secure a legacy for those we leave behind. The emotional contagion of this story spread rapidly across the globe, transcending cultural and linguistic barriers, as millions of people watched the clip, shared their own stories of grief and loss, and found a renewed sense of hope in the darkness of their own suffering. The contrast principle was on full display throughout this entire saga, the bright artificial lights and manufactured cheerfulness of late-night television serving as the perfect, stark backdrop for the raw, unpolished, and devastatingly real tragedy of a dying father and his sick child. It was the juxtaposition of Jimmy Fallon's usual slapstick comedy with his genuine, uncontrolled weeping, and Jonathan Roumie's dignified, stoic portrayal of a religious icon with his completely shattered, trembling humanity that made the moment so incredibly powerful and unforgettable. The authority of these two beloved celebrities, men who are typically viewed as untouchable entertainers living in a world of wealth and privilege, was completely dismantled by the pure, innocent sorrow of a 7-year-old boy, proving that grief is the ultimate equalizer, a universal experience that strips away all our societal masks and leaves us with nothing but our shared fragile humanity. Fast forward to an epilogue 3 years later, a time jump that brings a much-needed ray of brilliant, piercing light to this profoundly emotional narrative. Tommy, the brave little boy who stood on that massive stage and broke the hearts of millions with his quiet dignity, is now 10 years old and miraculously against all the daunting, terrifying medical odds that once clouded his future, he is officially in complete remission. The cancer that ravaged his small body and threatened to take him away just as it had taken his father has been defeated, a victory that feels almost miraculous given the intense suffering he endured during his youngest years. He continues to carry his father's leather-bound notebook with him, having already opened several of the letters as he reached the designated milestones, finding incredible strength and guidance in the words written by a man who loved him enough to fight through excruciating pain just to see him turn 7. Jonathan Roumie and Jimmy Fallon have both remained in contact with Tommy and his family, quietly supporting them away from the glare of the public eye, their lives forever changed by the brief, extraordinary intersection of their paths on that fateful night at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. The story of Tommy, his father, Jonathan, and Jimmy stands as a monumental, heartbreaking, yet ultimately uplifting reminder of the fragility of life and the incredible power we hold to impact one another in our darkest hours. It challenges us to look beyond the superficial distractions of our daily routines, to recognize the profound, often hidden suffering of those around us, and to respond with the same kind of radical, unscripted compassion that Jonathan and Jimmy displayed when confronted with a grieving child. It reminds us that our words, our art, and even our silly jokes can serve as vital lifelines to people drowning in despair, and that the promises we make to those we love are sacred bonds that can transcend even the finality of death. As you reflect on the tears shed on that stage, the silence that deafened a comedy club, and the 4 words that shattered 2 grown men, let it be a catalyst for a deeper, more intentional way of living and loving in a world that so desperately needs empathy. Do not wait for a tragic diagnosis to tell the people in your life what they mean to you. Do not hesitate to offer comfort to a stranger carrying a heavy burden, and never underestimate the monumental impact of simply showing up and being entirely present in someone else's pain. Make sure others know they are seen, valued, and loved beyond measure.